Child Welfare Virtual Expo 2018. Restore, Refresh, and Reenergize. Organizational strategies to address secondary traumatic stress in the workforce.
Welcome back to the Child Welfare Virtual Expo. I'm Jean Swift, Project Director for the National Child Abuse and Neglect Technical Assistance and Strategic Dissemination Center, or CANTASD. We're a service of the Children's Bureau's Office on Child Abuse and Neglect. During the break, I hope you had a chance to chat in the Virtual Expo exhibit hall and to post your why on the virtual bulletin board. If you could see me but you're having trouble hearing me, please adjust the speakers on your computer, and if you need technical assistance, check with the help desk. Our skills seminar this afternoon is Restore, Refresh, and Reenergize, Organizational Strategies for Addressing Secondary Traumatic Stress in the Workforce. It's been said that aside from war, child welfare workers see the worst that people can do and to the most vulnerable among us. And it's impossible to do this work without being affected by it. For some of us, working with children and families who've been traumatized and hearing their stories begins to affect us, and we have symptoms of traumatic stress ourselves. This is called secondary traumatic stress, or STS, and it's not uncommon among child welfare staff. And if it's not addressed, it can become problematic not just for the individual, but for the agencies and the children and families we serve. So what does STS look like? For individuals, it can be many things. Emotionally or physically, you might have symptoms like headaches or stomach aches or your heart beating faster or trouble sleeping. You might have psychological or emotional difficulties like anxiety and dread and feelings of helplessness or hopelessness, anger, mood swings, a variety of things. You might engage in some behaviors that have the potential to be harmful, like substance use, eating too much or too little, or you might distance yourself from your loved ones and people who could provide you some support. There are also personal histories that come into play here. If you have firsthand experience with some of the situations you're dealing with, that makes you more vulnerable to secondary traumatic stress. It comes back for you. Historical trauma is a factor for many of us. American Indian, Alaska Native, or African American colleagues in particular, among others. If you live in some areas like rural areas or tribal communities, the children and families you're serving may be your neighbors or your friends or members of your family, and that could put you at heightened risk also. So this is the impact on the individuals. What does this have to do with the agency? Well, agencies really are collections of people. They're groups of people. And if some of those people start to exhibit signs of secondary traumatic stress, it can have a negative impact on the whole organization. If people start to feel anxiety and dread and avoidance or anger, mood swings, it can change the tone within the agency, start to make it feel uncomfortable, not a safe place for people. They start being very reactive or not reactive at all. They stop communicating with one another, coordinating with one another. Productivity goes down, staff turnover can go up, and in general, the agency has a harder time meeting its mandate. Research tells us that for frontline child welfare staff, turnover is about 25% a year. That's huge. For agencies, the staff who are left behind have higher caseloads to deal with, and of course it doesn't help agency morale. And the cost of recruiting, training, and hiring new staff is tremendous. It's about $54,000 per person, according to our colleagues at NCWI, the National Child Welfare Workforce Institute. When you have this kind of disruption at an agency and this kind of stress among staff, it has negative consequences for the children and families that were being served. The families sense the negative emotions. They get the turnover and the delays and the compromised services, and it's not a useful situation. I'm pleased to introduce Elliott Hinkle, who has a great deal of firsthand experience, both as a youth in foster care and now as a staff person in the agency. Elliott?
Hi, my name is Elliott Hinkle, and I grew up in foster care in the state of Wyoming. And growing up in care, before I entered the foster care system, the trauma that I experienced and some of the rejection that I felt when I was in foster care, I didn't realize how much that would benefit me in my future work in child welfare and how I'd be able to connect with the young people that I serve now. Growing up in Wyoming's foster care system, I found some support, but I struggled to get all the supports that I needed. And I wanted to be able to give back to the system and serve youth in ways that I didn't really feel that I had when I was in foster care. So I moved to Portland, Oregon, and I now work at an agency called New Avenues for Youth, where I get to work with young people who are 16 to 21, who are in the foster care system now, or they're aging out of the foster care system, and I get to teach them life skills. To teach them life skills, part of my job is to build a relationship with them. And building a relationship with them comes with sharing some of my lived experience in the system and hearing about theirs. But what that also means is that sharing those lived experiences with each other can bring up some traumatic events that can activate my own trauma, and also things that I have to navigate with them. To be able to have that shared experience, I have to be able to have support in the workplace to navigate what's coming up for me and to know how to support the young people I'm with. Some of what that looks like in the workplace for me is having supportive supervision. That's weekly and group supervision with my team, where we're able to bond and use humor and different tools that happen naturally to come together to share about the work that we're doing and how we're navigating supporting the young people we work with. I also do things in my personal life, like seeking counseling or doing things for self-care, like going on hikes or doing things that I find fulfilling and that kind of fill me up. I've also learned to have some good boundaries at work, where I turn off my phone or I don't check my email when I'm off work, so that way I'm able to really check out and take time for myself, so that way when I come back to work I can show up better the next day. Some of the other things that happen at work are getting some good professional development, so I have goals to look forward to and where I'm headed in my work. But all of this is really important to think about the fact that we all experience trauma in different ways in the workplace and in our lives. But being in a setting, in a workforce that is supportive of complex traumas is really important for me to be able to do my job well. Thank you.
Jean resumes.
Thank you, Elliott. I appreciate your sharing some of your personal experience, how this work has affected you personally, and the support you've gotten from your agency, which I think is really important. You know, self-care for staff is very important. The more that you learn about this and can put words to what you're experiencing, the better you can understand it and deal with it more effectively. And we have resources in our pod that you might find useful. Kent SD is also launching this fall an innovation stream around workforce support and secondary traumatic stress, so there are more resources to come. But self-care is not enough. Agencies need to take steps to support the workforce and also to ensure that the culture of the agency itself doesn't become damaging. Those people who leave agencies, that high staff turnover, the #1 reason they leave is the agency. It's not the trauma and the stress from working with families. It's the stress-related situation in the workplace itself that becomes unbearable. Thankfully, there's been a great deal of work done in recent years on steps that agencies can take to be more trauma-informed and support the workforce, and we have 2 pioneers in that area with us this afternoon to talk about organizational strategies. Cambria Rose Walsh is project co-director with the Center for Child Welfare Trauma-Informed Policy Program and Practice. And Alan O'Malley Larson is a program manager with Olmsted County Child and Family Services in Minnesota. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Jean, very much, and Elliott for sharing your personal story with us. That was very enlightening and is going to be reflected a lot in the work that we talk about today. So we started this work in 2012 under a grant from with SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. And as we did this particular work, we didn't do it alone. We did it in partnership with what we called super communities. And there were 5 different super communities across the United States that we worked with. We worked with a community in Volusia County, Florida. And they actually were the ones that kind of started us down the path into what we will talk about today, as they had already laid some of the groundwork for this particular work. We also worked with Custer County, which is a small rural county in Oklahoma. We worked with the entire state of Rhode Island because they're small, and you can work with a whole state when they're as small as Rhode Island is. We worked with Orange County in California, and we worked with a 5-county cluster in southeastern Minnesota, which is where Alan and I met, and it was some of the partnership between the two of us that kind of has led to our presenting and talking about all of the work that all of the folks within these super communities partnered on in terms of putting together this particular guide. And it's also important to point out that the reason that we focused on secondary trauma was that this was something that all 5 of those communities very clearly were grappling with and were asking for help and wanted us to provide some assistance in terms of how to think through how to address this within their systems. And not just at the individual level, but they really wanted to look at how organizationally can we focus on this particular issue. So together, all of us worked together and created the Secondary Traumatic Stress in Child Welfare Practices, Trauma-Informed Guidelines for Organizations, or STS guidelines, as we call it for short, because that's quite a mouthful to say on its own. And you can find that the STS guidelines are in your resource pod, so you're welcome to take a look at that as we talk about it today, and also it's yours to download and use as time goes on. So we've learned a lot as the STS guidelines have been implemented in agencies around the country, and we're developing some supplemental material with a new grant that we currently have with SAMHSA called the TIP Center. But the STS guidelines are really the focus of today. And I just say that we're continuing to work on them because this is an evolving area, and we continue to learn more each day about how to address secondary trauma.
And I want to thank Jean again for that very well done overview of secondary traumatic stress, and also the emphasis on the fact that STS is an agency and organizational concern and should not be left just to the individual staff person. I also want to note that while we're going to talk about STS here today, that it is just one component of a larger sense of workplace stress that we all have to deal with in child welfare. And so I want to make that distinction, and then also just point you to one of the resources in the resource pod, a document as well as a link to a micro presentation on multidimensional human services stress. And that provides a much more extensive conversation around that particular aspect of secondary stress being a component of the larger aspect of workplace stress. I also want to invite you to use the reflection journal that you can also find in the resource pod as a way to record your thoughts and comments throughout the conversation that we have today, and then you can bring some of those into the chats that we have afterwards as well.
So we wanted to start off with this quote to really ground us in what we would like to strive for in terms of thinking about what should an organization that's being supportive for workers and helping them build resilience about secondary traumatic stress look like. The place workers journey out from and return to be revitalized, experience security, and replenish themselves to be re-energized to go back out to practice, right? So that's what we want the organization to really look like. So the secondary traumatic stress guidelines provide information along a continuum of practice. So as we worked with the communities, what Florida had already kind of set the groundwork for us was to look at it through kind of this life of the workforce. And so the first piece in doing this and thinking about this was, how do you implement this? What do you need to have in place to really use the STS guidelines? And so the first thing is you really want to create a team, and a team that's going to be able to focus on this and work together. And you want that team to not just consist of leadership. It's very important that there's leadership that have buy-in, that help drive this process, but you also really want to make sure that you're hearing the voices of your caseworkers, certainly of supervisors, and also of support staff who are often forgotten in this process. We focus very much on the work workers who are out there meeting with clients directly, and we forget that the receptionist at the front desk is also very impacted often by the trauma that plays out with these families right in the office itself. And so remembering that as you're looking at how to do this, you want to hear voices from all levels of the workforce. It's really important to include supervisors in this process, and I point them out specifically because what we heard earlier from Jean about turnover. We know that turnover is very high in child welfare, and supervisors tend to be a little bit more stable part of the workforce. They tend to have made it through those early years in the child welfare system as a caseworker and are now in a position where they're supervising, and they tend to stay longer and have a little bit less turnover. They're also, unlike the higher level leaders, not as much at political whim. We saw in several of the super communities that we worked with changes in the high level of leadership because a governor had decided to appoint somebody different, or there were changes in politics that happened that caused some of those changeovers. And the supervisors, on the other hand, stayed fairly stable during that time. So you really want to make sure that you engage them in this process. So the guidelines are divided into 5 key sections, and again along kind of this timeline of the workforce. So we have information there about the hiring phase, so thinking about things like how do you interview, how do you do the application process, having realistic job previews, all are important things to look at in terms of hiring. The first 3 months, which are really critical, as somebody is just starting into this new job, how do you orient them, what do you do that first day on the job. The cumulative effects section, which is really focused on the ongoing impacts of secondary trauma for workers from that first day that they step into the office through the entire time that they're working there, and over time, how are they being affected by secondary trauma. We have a section on critical incidents, which looks at very specific critical incidents that happen within child welfare and how do you address those. And then finally, there's a section on evaluation, although I shouldn't really say finally, because we want to be evaluating all along the way. We don't want to just wait until an exit interview with somebody to find out that they were really being impacted by secondary trauma and the programs and practices we had in place weren't helping them. We really want to be getting their feedback along the way. And so there's information then, that evaluation section, about how to do that and kind of how to look at it along the way. What we're going to primarily focus on for our time with you today is the cumulative effects section. And actually, this is where we tell teams when they're first looking at this where they really need to start. Because the reality is, if you're not addressing the cumulative effects and somebody is going through the hiring process and you say you have all these wonderful programs in place, you're going to be in a lot of trouble when you hire them and you orient them and they realize that you don't really have these programs in place and you're not really supporting your workforce. So you really want to hone in on what are the supports you're providing on an ongoing basis and then use those to kind of build upon through the hiring phase in the first 3 months. So the key elements that we're going to be talking about today are within that cumulative effects section, and those are individual assessment, building resiliency, support systems, and this includes professional development and supervision, coverage and caseloads, empowerment and advocacy, involving employees in the decision-making process, and then we're going to talk a little about recognition and team building and peer support. So the first key element, as I just mentioned, is individual assessment, and there are formal tools that you can use for individual assessment. The compassion fatigue self-test, the ProQual 5, the STS scale are examples of those. All of those have links within the STS guidelines that you can click on and get to them. They're all free tools that you're able to use. They're in the public domain. And so it's really important to have workers have an awareness of kind of where they're at. And Elliott alluded to that a little bit when he was talking, that having that awareness, that knowledge of how am I doing with this work and constantly checking in with yourself is really critical. So Alan, tell us a little bit about how individual assessment has been used within Olmsted County. How have you addressed that?
Thank you. Yes, we have tried to do the best we can to try to build some of these strategies into our ongoing process so that it isn't just something like a good idea or a policy statement, but we've actually got some practices that are implemented. And one of the things that we've done is we've implemented some questions into our performance review process whereby we are asking staff specific questions related to secondary stress in terms of how they're experiencing it and so on. And it's important to understand that we do this not as part of the performance evaluation per se, because it doesn't factor into their ratings per se, but just as a way to create some dialogue and conversation about secondary traumatic stress and to send the message that as an organization this is an important issue for us, it's something we're concerned about and something we're going to work with you on. the specific questions that we ask in there, and I would ask you as an audience just to think about a couple of these questions for yourself. The first one has to do with what is your level of experience regarding secondary traumatic stress over the past 10 years, or past year, and then we ask them to rate that on a scale of 1 to 10. So you might think about that for yourself. Well, where am I at in terms of my level of secondary stress over the past year? A second question we'll ask then is, how are you feeling supported, or how well supported are you feeling by your supervisor, your management, and your organization? Again, scaling that on a 1 to 10. And I would suggest that you might think about that for yourself in terms of how do you feel supported by your supervisor and your organization. And then we ask questions about what can we do better as an organization to meet your needs around secondary traumatic stress, and then a little bit about what is it you're doing that helps you to maintain your well-being and your sense of competency and so on. And so we ask those questions every year, and hopefully we're having conversation about that. And if need be, if it points out some critical needs, then we can build some things into like a wellness plan as to what we might do over the next year to kind of address some of those questions. The other thing that we've been doing is doing a survey of all of our staff at the same point in time. In other words, using a survey monkey to ask questions again about how are you doing with this, what can we do better, and that type of thing. And what's your knowledge level of secondary stress? Because we're trying to make sure that we're embedding the understanding and appreciation of this within our workforce. So that's like a snapshot of the entire organization at one time, whereas the other one is more of an individual assessment at that point in time for them. And you can find examples of those questions in the appendixes of the STS guidelines.
Wonderful. So as we move into looking at the second and third key elements, we actually combine these in terms of talking about them because there's a lot of overlap. So these are building resiliency and support systems, and in order to really build resiliency, you have to have good support systems. So it makes sense that there's quite a bit of overlap here. And this is another piece that we heard from Elliott earlier. He talked about how important his support system was, and that's really a very critical and key point for us to look at is how are you getting support both within the workplace and outside of the workplace. So in terms of building resilience, we talk about several key areas. We talk about humor. It's very important to have humor in the workplace. Of course, you want that to be appropriate humor. And if you're telling jokes that you wouldn't tell in front of the families that you're working with, then you probably need to rethink whether that's appropriate humor or not, right? So we say you always want to make sure that you're doing it to bolster yourself and not to put somebody else down. We also talk in here about optimism, and we know that these are very difficult jobs that folks are in, and we're not saying wear rose-colored glasses and go around thinking that everything is wonderful all the time, but we do think that if you focus on having an optimistic explanatory style, which is one in which when positive things happen, that you're able to see the role that you played in those positive things happening, and that when negative things happen, you kind of see them as not being typical, that those are not the way the world is on an everyday basis. And that plays out a lot when we think about how world perspective can change when you're doing this type of work. So for instance, if you go to the playground and you see a group of children at the playground and you suddenly are thinking, oh my gosh, all of them have been through some sort of abusive situation, clearly your perspective on the world has been impacted by the type of work that you're doing, because we know there are a lot of healthy children out there, and we want to be able to see that positive and not immediately go to the negative. So working within the culture of the organization on how do you help people continue to have a sense of optimism among this very difficult work. The next piece that we talk about under building resiliency is active coping. And active coping is really looking at strategies that you have to address the problem in a way that's constructive and or be able to kind of reframe that problem. And this is in direct contrast to what we would call avoidant coping strategies, which are those in which you engage in behaviors to avoid the particular problem that's going on, and we see a lot of that, unfortunately, that people get into because they're trying to numb themselves or dissociate themselves from the work. And you have to have empathy in this work. You have to be able to engage with the families that you're working with. So you have to figure out how to cope in a more active way. We also talk in here about mindfulness and mindfulness strategies that you can do kind of on an everyday basis. So what are the things that you do when you walk into a situation where you're working with a family and you know it might be difficult? How do you ground yourself and make sure you're staying there with that particular family? And how do you regulate your emotions in those particular situations? We also talk about positive thinking, and this comes directly from the world of cognitive behavioral therapy, where we know that our thoughts impact our feelings, which in turn impact our behaviors. And so we want to be looking at what are our thinking patterns and how are those impacting how we feel and how are they impacting how we behave. And then finally, again, having that self-awareness and knowing when it is that something isn't going as it should be. In terms of support systems, we talk about, as I mentioned, both external and internal support systems. So do you have counseling that's available outside of the office? Do people feel like they can take advantage of that and there's not a stigma around seeking help? And what does supervision look like for folks? Are they able to talk to their supervisor, and are the supervisors trained in ways that are able to support staff? And then looking at professional development and what type of training is out there. What we know is that when you feel more competent in the work that you're doing, you're going to be able to have a lot more resiliency, and you're going to be able to handle the trauma that you're interacting with in a much stronger way. So Alan, tell us a little bit about some of the things you've done in Olmsted. I know there's been a resource list. You guys have done some interdepartmental pieces. Tell us a little more what that's looked like.
Sure. And what we've also done is we've developed an employees assistance program type of arrangement with one of our local mental health centers, where we have a contract between our human resources department and the mental health center to provide some short-term counseling for folks who feel like they need something beyond what we can provide within the agency. And that's it's a totally confidential process whereby there are no notes taken, there's no feedback given back to the agency other than there's a bill that gets sent to the HR department behind the scenes with no names attached to it. And we believe that that's a very important resource to have for folks. We also provide a lot of resources for folks to take a look at. On our SharePoint site, we have downloaded a number of different documents and resources for folks to take a look at. And you can find those in the downloadable or in the resource pod as well. And one of them I really want to highlight is a publication that comes from the University of Minnesota Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare, entitled Secondary Trauma and the Child Welfare Workforce. And it's just a wonderful collection of ideas from pretty much all of the folks who know anything about secondary stress. And very brief articles. It's a real wonderful document for people to download just for informational purposes. Because we really do believe that knowledge is power, and the more that we know about these kinds of things, if we can name it, we have a concept or a way of thinking about it, and that sense that this is a reality for me, it's not something wrong with me, I think that's that goes a long ways to alleviating that sense of secondary stress. We've also developed an interdepartmental work group where we've invited folks from different parts of our department to get together. And we formed this work group about 3 or 4 years ago for a couple of reasons. And one was to be able to increase the knowledge and awareness within our organization about secondary traumatic stress. And then the second was to talk about and come up with some ideas about what we can do about it. In fact, pretty much all of the strategies that I've talked about and will talk about that we're employing at Olmsted County have come from that work group in terms of just coming together and coming up with some ideas, moving them on to the management level and getting approval, and then integrating those into the system. So that's been an amazing process for us. And it has pointed out the critical nature of having management support. Our director at the time was 100% behind what we were doing, and that was just absolutely critical, because if we didn't have that, nothing was going to happen. I'm also really proud of what we're doing in Olmsted County on a larger basis. Our county administrator has required all departments throughout the county to submit a wellness goal within their annual plans. And so that idea of paying attention to employee wellness is essentially coming through the entire county system, which is, I think, exceptional. The other thing that we've done is that we have manager meetings in our department every Monday morning, and one of the agenda items on there is secondary traumatic stress. And it's just on there for whatever comes up we might want to talk about as a group, or to make sure that it's just constantly in our awareness as supervisors and managers. And then we have monthly department meetings where we bring all our staff together. And then what we've done is we've set aside the last 15 minutes of each of those meetings to be used for some sort of follow-up and conversation around secondary stress, and use those opportunities for further information, to get people thinking, talking, that type of thing. And then finally, we've done a lot to try to integrate secondary traumatic stress into our ongoing case consultation process, that supervision process. And we've done quite a bit of stuff around what's called appreciative inquiry, and then also around reflective supervision. And I'll touch on that just a little bit later too.
Wonderful. Yeah, Olmsted has done so many wonderful things to really integrate it into the culture there. It's wonderful to hear about all of those. So the fourth area that we're going to very briefly talk about is coverage and caseloads that we have in the STS guidelines. In terms of caseloads, we know that the ideal is to have lower caseloads. We also know that in most places people don't have control over those caseloads. So looking at, is there a way to vary the types of cases that they have? What is within your control in terms of looking at that? And that can be a very challenging area. And in the guidelines, we do provide some suggestions around that. We also provide some information around coverage and around schedules. We all know that doctor's appointments and school plays and kids' soccer practice don't happen after hours, and we want to give staff the ability to participate in those things and to have some sense of balance to what's going on in their lives. So any flexible scheduling that you can do can be really important to give them that sense of having some control over what's going on with their day-to-day schedule. In terms of on-call work, it's really critical with on-call work that there's a plan for that people don't feel like they're on 24/7, that when they take a vacation, they can actually take a vacation and not feel like they're going to get a call from work or they're going to have an emergency that they have to cover. So having plans in place for that type of coverage is really important. Can you tell us a little bit about how Olmsted has handled that? I know you guys have done some things with that 24/7 coverage piece.
Yep. Yeah, we've been very fortunate to have good administrative support for maintaining caseloads that are manageable, but also having 24/7 coverage. And we have a host of after-hours workers who can cover after hours. And even though sometimes the worker themselves will get calls about cases, oftentimes it gets screened by this after-hours group who can oftentimes manage the situation and respond to it to kind of give some space there for our staff. We've also been very good about caseload sizes. In a child protection area, probably running in the 6 to 8 cases per worker, and in child welfare more around 12 to 15. And obviously the smaller the caseload, the better work you're able to do. But that always gets challenged every year around budget time too, when we're taking a look at what the next year and what we can do and how we can maintain that, as well as the influx of referrals as they come in, which we really don't have much control over as well. And then flexible schedules is so critical because the notion of in this line of work, it often requires folks to do some work later in the day, sometimes in the evenings, just because of people's schedules, kids in school, and that type of thing. And it's important that we give the flexibility for staff that if they're working a little bit late here, they take some time off over here. It also allows folks to take part in some of their kids' activities at school and so on, and take care of some of those things during the regular normal work hours, which I think is important. And I think there's good research that will say that the flexibility of scheduling is an important issue and something that's helpful for mediating the whole idea of secondary traumatic stress. The other thing that I've been doing a lot with my staff lately too is just encouraging them to turn the doggone smartphone off at night. And stop reading your work emails after work, something that Elliott alluded to. A very helpful, simple little thing, but it can make such a difference in terms of how you're experiencing the work and having that separation between work and home.
Yeah, and so good for you to model that as a manager, because I think a lot of times people get those emails from their manager after hours and they feel pressured. I have to respond. My manager's working. I should be working too.
That's right. That's right.
So the next area we're going to talk about is our fifth area that's in the STS guidelines, and this is on empowerment and advocacy. And this really looks at how do you involve your staff in the decision making and providing feedback mechanisms about what's going on and giving you feedback about what types of professional development might be helpful for them and those types of things. And it's important to involve them in this not just around secondary trauma, but also in general. How do they get to have a voice in terms of how things are handled within the organization and feel like the organization actually listens to them and feels like what they're saying is important to hear. So Alan, tell us a little bit. I know you mentioned the Wellness Committee before. Tell us a little bit about how this plays out in Olmsted.
Sure. So in addition to having the work group that's specific to secondary traumatic stress, we've also got a Wellness Committee that's recently come together with the effort of trying to just come up with different kinds of activities and events that people can involve themselves in, things around relaxation even, having lunches together, doing different things to kind of just take care of themselves kind of thing. And that's been a nice little addition to what we've been doing. And then earlier I mentioned a little bit about the supervision process and a couple of, I think, critical strategies, the one being appreciative inquiry, which is a process whereby there's this intentional effort to pull out, elicit good work that people are doing, and then emphasize that and praise that and make a lot of big deal about that. And we find that that's been just a very good way for people to not only feel good about themselves and the work they're doing, but also to help highlight some of those sometimes unconscious processes that we get involved in when we're working. We don't even realize what good work we're doing. And so it's a good way to pull that out. And the second area that we're working more and more on is reflective supervision, which is the idea essentially of dealing with the emotional impact that this work has on us. It's not so much about the details of the case, it's about how it's impacting me. And we talk about that, try to process that, with the idea that if we can work through that, the emotional reaction part, and have self-regulation, then we can activate that thinking part of the brain, so to speak, and have a much more intentional, thoughtful process in terms of the work that we do.
Wonderful. And there's some information in the STS guidelines on reflective supervision that provides a little bit more detail and links to additional resources on that as well. So the sixth and final element that we're going to talk about today is on recognition, team building, and support. And again, this is a very important area from an organizational standpoint for workers to feel like they're valued and they're cared for by the agency, and that they have a way to be able to get some support within the agency, even if it's not within supervision, but from their peers, and how do they do that? So one of the things that we really talk about in the guidelines and that we really suggest is the idea of low-impact debriefing. And this particular model comes out of Tend Academy, and it's work that was done by one of the co-directors, Francois Mathieu. And low-impact debriefing has 4 steps to it. The first step is to really have an increased self-awareness. When is it that you're asking to talk about people? What are the things that might be triggering you in certain cases, and what is it you need from your peers in terms of being able to kind of debrief what's happened to you? I think a lot of us have the tendency when we have a really difficult encounter or are having secondary traumatic stress going on, we want to go rush and get that out of ourselves, right? And so we almost call that kind of this emotional vomiting, where we feel like we have to get it out, and by doing that, what we don't always realize is that somebody is the recipient of that, and that's a really pretty unpleasant place to be. So we want to be very careful in terms of how we do that. So having that self-awareness of when you need help. The second step is to give fair warning. So just like you wouldn't give really bad news to a relative without giving them some fair warning that you have something difficult to share with them, you want to do the same thing with your colleagues and say, you know, I've had a really difficult case and I'm looking for somebody to talk with. And then you want to get their consent. You don't want to assume that they're in a place that they're going to be ready to hear that, because the reality is they might have just had a really difficult encounter as well and may not be in a place where they can be there to support you. And it would be good for you to know that, and it would be good for them to not take that on at that point in time. So you want to respect if they say to you, this really isn't a good time, or I can only handle, you know, if you're able to share kind of this much level of detail, I can handle that, but I can't be there any much beyond that right now, and it might be better to find somebody else right now to talk with. So again, making sure that all of the staff is aware of this process and is able to know that it's okay to say no, and it's okay to communicate about wanting help and how to ask for that. And then the fourth step is when you actually do the debrief with somebody, that you don't necessarily need to tell them every last gory detail about what's going on. So if you had a really difficult case and what's really getting to you is that in that particular case, the child is the same age as your child at home, and you're having all these haunting thoughts about that because it reminds you of your own child, you can talk about that without having to share every detail of what happened in that particular case with your colleague, right? You can kind of process, again, some of the feelings around that without telling them every single thing that had happened. So this is a great way, and there's more information, as I mentioned, in the STS guidelines about how to set this up and how to use this with your particular staff. So Alan, tell us a little bit about some of the things you've done around peer support, team building, recognition in Olmsted County.
Sure. In addition to the consultation process, one of the things that we've just started to do fairly recently is have these, what I'm calling kind of a celebration of success. Mm-hmm. And essentially what it is bringing some folks together on a case that's gone well, that people have done good work in and had some successful outcomes in, and bringing folks together and talking about that, and bringing everybody together that's touched that case, and not just talking about how well the case has turned out, but what kind of impact did you have as a worker. I think eliciting, again, that sense of, I made a difference here, and that's important. And having that sort of department-wide celebration with cupcakes and all that kind of stuff, kind of thing, has been a pretty cool thing. And what we're going to do now, too, is take a little clip, a little video clip of a interview that was done with some of our staff by a consultant that we had come in. And I wanted to show this because it says a little bit about the organization that we've created, I think, through the work that we've done with secondary traumatic stress, and that the impact it's had on the culture and the work culture, and in some way kind of gets us maybe close to that optimal workplace. I'm not sure. But I think there's some interesting comments in here that reflect the work that we've done, so we're going to show that now.
Great.
A classroom is shown with several rows of child welfare staff seated. The speakers, also staff, are seated among the other participants.
So, I guess, and I'm not sure if I'm answering this question, you've asked so many in the last 5 minutes that I'm getting lost now, but I would just like to say that I don't go home feeling stressed. My family knows that I'm available, that I'm there, that, you know, in past jobs there's been times where I've gone home and it's like, I'm sorry guys, I just need time for myself, and it shouldn't be that way. And that doesn't happen here. And if that starts to happen, our supervisors are amazing and they recognize that. They recognize it sometimes before we do. And that happened to me recently with a case that was really hard, and I didn't want to give up on it, but I was able to go to my supervisor without feeling ashamed or scared and, you know, share my worries. And my supervisor was able to recognize that I was having some secondary stress reaction to that and help me work through that. So a shout out to all our amazing supervisors who help us through and, you know, give us the confidence and the room to express our real feelings and not have to worry.
You exactly answered the question. So let's hear from a couple more of you about you. You know, bring it to that place of what's it like for you being in this culture.
I just want to say, so I've been in my position for 10 years now, and there has been ups and downs because it's not always peachy. And the thing that I appreciate and why I'm still here is because there's the deliberate focus on secondary stress and our holistic well-being at Olmsted County. And there's programs that are put in place, work groups, there's the obvious signs and posters, but there's the discussion that's put into our individual supervision groups. It's just part of our culture about taking care of ourselves. And when we're not doing the best that we can, like with our own personal well-being, there is those deliberate conversations with the people that supervise us to talk about how are we taking care of ourselves and making sure that we focus on not only how are we doing at our job, but making sure there's a life-work balance. It's just that holistic picture that we look at, and I appreciate that. That's what keeps me here.
Yeah, that's just another thing that I think every
Alan O'Malley Larson, Olmsted County, Minnesota Children and Family Services.
I just have to say that that really makes me proud in terms of the work that we've tried to do over the past few years around addressing secondary stress in the workplace, and that it seems to be having an impact on the culture, ultimately on the workers, ultimately on the work that we're doing with families. So I thought that was a nice piece to share.
Cambria Rose Walsh, Center for Child Welfare, Trauma-Informed Policies, Programs, and Practices at Chadwick Center.
Yeah, I think that's really wonderful feedback and speaks a lot to the culture that you all have created in Olmsted. And I appreciate your willingness to share that and your colleagues' willingness to have us share that with everybody on the summit today. So we're at the end of our time here. We just want to really quickly recap that we went through the 6 different areas: individual assessment, resiliency building, support systems, coverage and caseloads, empowerment and advocacy, employees being involved in the decision-making process, and the recognition, team building, and peer support that are all part of the cumulative effects section. If you go into the guidelines, there's a lot more information on the other particular sections on the critical incidents, on the first 3 months, on hiring, and all of that that you can find within those guidelines. So we're now at the end of our remarks, and we'll soon transition into the virtual reflections. This is an opportunity to reflect on what you just heard from both Alan and I, and from Jean and Elliott as well. We hope that you've been using your 3-column reflective paper that we had in there for you and been collecting some good ideas as we've been going through. In a moment, you will see your screen change as you're automatically moved into the virtual learning lab. If you encounter any issues, please return to the theater and access the Learning tab under the Virtual Reflection tab. And please note that Virtual Reflection worksheet is available to download in the Resources pod. And you can use this worksheet as well to document your reflections that you've had throughout the time. Following our virtual reflection activities, we ask that you share your feedback by completing the session evaluation, and then come join us. Alan and I are actually going to be in the exhibit hall in the Canton SD booth, and along with some other participants to continue the conversation. And after chatting with us, be sure to visit our virtual message board in the networking lounge to share why you stay in child welfare using the hashtag #ShareYourWhy. You can also join a virtual chat session in the State Spotlights booth in the exhibit hall, which will start at 3 p.m. Eastern. And our closing reflections will begin at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. Thank you for your participation in this session, and we look forward to chatting with you in the Learning Lab.
Thank you.
Logo for the Child Welfare Virtual Expo 2018.